new experience of getting together. There's a wonderful book called Wired Love, an 1890 novel. In it, two telegraph operators fall in love virtually, and when they get together, they're tongue-tied until he strings a wire across two rooms of a boarding house, and finally he proposes in Morse code. So bingo, we had virtuality more than 100 years ago. The importance of that is that these changes in our life have been building for a very long time. All that we're struggling with didn't come in with the BlackBerry or the iPod. So we need to look deeply back in history to understand what we're wrestling with.
Until the invention of the telegraph, it was not possible to communicate any information beyond earshot or eyesight simultaneously. Or as Marshall McLuhan stated, it was not until the advent of the telegraph that messages could travel faster than a messenger. The telegraph paved the trail for telephones, radio, television, and the internet. It created a new era of simultaneous living. No doubt things have been changing fast. Who would have imagined that the family in the 50s who stopped in front of the department store window to admire the new display of TVs would give rise to a society with more TVs than children per household? In fact, there are now more TVs than there are people per household. My family doesn't fit the national average. God has blessed us with 4 children, and many might think we're odd for not having a TV in our home. I began traveling across the country with my family after starting a nonprofit organization in 2005 called Media Talk 101, which is dedicated to teaching about media discernment in the light of following Christ. I've had the opportunity to speak at churches, schools, camps, and conferences, and also began producing materials to help educate others on the subject. This was not something I'd anticipated or doing years ago when I got my start in ministry. After high school, I moved to Chicago to work with a church, reaching out to inner-city children and youth. I started to use my skills of freestyle BMX riding for outreach purposes, as a platform for sharing biblical truths and the life-changing message of the gospel of Christ. This was the beginning of my ministry to youth and adults that has now spanned over 2 decades. What started out with a bicycle eventually branched out into music and ministering as a pastor. In all of this, I recognized that media and entertainment was one of the biggest stumbling blocks to spiritual growth and family health in our nation. I know I'm not the only one concerned, so I set out to interview other authors, speakers, pastors, and teachers on this subject. And there are several concerns that are usually brought up. The first is media consumption.
Presently, the screen time for the average American child is over 53 hours a week. And so, we have a very out of balance diet in terms of activity diet for the typical American child, and it's overbalanced in the direction of media and technology.
The average young person, by the time he or she graduates from high school, will have seen anywhere from 18,000 to 22,000 hours of television. That means they will have spent more time in front of a television set than they will have spent in a classroom.
And the kids are doing the social things out of class all the time. They average, according to Nielsen Media, 3,339 text messages per month. When Pew Research did a study of youth and digital tools, they were astounded by the number of teenagers who sleep with the cell phone under their pillow on. If a text message comes through at 2 o'clock in the morning, they want it to wake them up.
All of the technological devices that have emerged in the last 100 years have resulted in an all-you-can-eat media buffet. And over the years, we have been conditioned to pile more and more on our plates. Aside from the amount of time that is spent, are there other concerns regarding media consumption? I took a trip to the Seattle Children's Research Hospital to meet up with Dr. Dimitri Kostakis, who is one of the nation's leading research doctors studying the effects of media on young children.
The newborn's brain triples in size in the first 2 years of life. It's an extraordinary period of brain growth, unparalleled over the entire lifespan. And it does that in direct response to external stimulation. So, if you will, the minds of children are fine-tuned to the world in which they inhabit. And the concern that I have had in my lab for some time, if we expose children during that critical developmental period to what I call a hyper-stimulating environment, too much television that happens in a surreal pacing, which a lot of television does, will condition babies' minds, high levels of input. They will come to view themselves as living in a world that is so fast-paced, that quickly changes scenes, and then by comparison, reality will seem boring. It doesn't happen fast enough. We'll shorten their attention spans. And what we've found in studies that we've done is just that. The more television children watch before the age of 3, the more likely they are to have shorter attention spans when they begin school.
The American Academy of Pediatrics has recommended for many years now that children under the age of 2 should be discouraged from watching any television. The concern doesn't stop with toddlers. Dr. Jeff Myers has worked with young adults for many years.
What happens when somebody's really working on something they find absolutely compelling and interesting, it floods this whole part of the brain with activity in a way that actually stimulates the pleasure center of the brain. So when you work at something you really find interesting, it brings pleasure to you. The studies in media are really disconcerting in this way because we're finding that video games, for example, are really overwhelming kind of media, HD TV and things like that that are so amazing and incredible in 3D. It stimulates the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure center of the brain, by draining blood away from the executive center of the brain. So it gives people the sense of accomplishment without ever having actually done anything. It has the same effect in the brain as somebody, except for the actual brain damage part of it, as somebody who smokes crack. It gives them the sense that they've done something really great when in fact they've done nothing at all. That's the effect that so much of the media has on kids today. And people ask me, well, why are so many young men passive? I changed the culture to trick their brains into thinking that they've done something when in fact they haven't.
When the first home video game console, Magnavox Odyssey, hit the market in 1972, it was unlikely that anyone could fathom the impact video games would have in homes almost 40 years later. In 2007, a remarkable record was set by the video game Halo 3. It had sold $170 million worth of games in 24 hours. That was not just a video game sales record, that was an entertainment industry sales record that was soon to be upstaged by Grand Theft Auto 4 and recently topped by the release of Call of Duty Black Ops, which sold $360 million in 24 hours.
There is a great need for concern. Every parent needs to be serious in thinking through all of these media issues. Now, 10% of children, according to the studies that have been done on this, are actually addicted to video games. They don't even have a category in the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual for this kind of addiction. But the scholars have found that when you look at the addiction to video games, it parallels one-to-one a gambling addiction. So parents who are not concerned are actually saying, it's okay with me if my child has a crippling addiction.
I had a soldier come into my office and he said, hey chaplain, I'm having nightmares and I'm having a difficulty sleeping. I keep seeing myself shooting at people and getting shot. I said, what is your job? He said, I'm a mechanic. I said, have you ever been outside the wire to actually be confronted by the enemy? He said, no. I said, do you play video games? He said, yeah, chap, I play a lot. I said, man, you need to stop. You haven't been shot out by the enemy, but it's the video games that's messing with your mind. It's the video games that's giving you combat stress. You're not getting combat stress from combat. It's that.
When you talk to your son about his violent video games, you'll find out if he's addicted because he's going to go off the deep end because you're offending him. He's defending what he's addicted to. Talk about his sister and he won't say a word. Talk about Modern Warfare 2 and he's going to go off the deep end.
Video games have embedded in our culture, and there are multiple concerns notwithstanding the ones already addressed. There are moral issues as well as concerns about the use of time, the potential of video game addiction, but also the false sense of accomplishment and the fostering of escapism.
The escape ramps from reality are everywhere, and we have way more escape routes than we've ever had before. We have young people playing their computer games, escaping into the world of the avatar. And this is 20, 30 times worse than it was in the 1970s. You remember in the 1970s when we had one computer game, that was Pong. I didn't know anybody addicted to Pong in the 1970s. Beep, beep, beep. It was hard to get addicted to a game like that. That was back in the 1970s. Well, now 40 years later, there are hundreds of times more men addicted to these games.
They're not really experiencing or living anything, you know. It's a complete waste of time. And there's so much God wants us to do with our talents and our treasures rather than spending our hard-earned money, valuable time, the finite time that we have to actually gain the rewards that you get from winning those video games. There's no real reward that translates into real life. And so that's part of the challenge for those folks that are ingrained into those video games. That's not real life. Get outside and experience real life. God has rewards for you outside of your cave with your TV, your iPod, or your PSP or Xbox. There's real life out there to live.
And these things are providing more and more opportunities for men to do what they want to do. They want to get away from reality. They want to escape from the real issues of life. And because of that, it's going to affect our very civilization, even as it affected Rome. Getting away from reality is getting away